stays in hospitals have been really traumatic for individuals and families in ways that really come from their having that disability, not so much from the individual disability or developmental disability. Maggie's going to share one of those stories right now.
Thanks, Bill. One of the things that is so interesting about my work here at the hospital, I cover the emergency department, the EDOU, the observation unit when you're not quite well enough to go home, but you're not sick enough necessarily to be admitted, and also the psychiatric emergency evaluation center. And as I was doing my rounds a couple of weeks ago in the PEAK, the psych unit, I encountered a young man whom we can call Brian, who was very engaging, very conversational, clearly had some issues going on, shadow boxing, seeing things that I could not see, hearing things that I could not hear. And in the midst of his psychiatric distress, I went through his chart and also learned that he was a young man with autism. And that was sort of the key for me to be able to engage with him in a way that was developmentally appropriate, in a way that was more accessible for him. He shared drawings with me. We had conversation. He danced up and down the corridor with me. And we ended up having this really lovely exchange in the midst of a very intimidating environment. So knowledge of what's going on with people apart from their acute illness that has brought them into the hospital, and having some tips and tricks, a bag of tools sort of, to be able to work with them and meet them where they are, has been, certainly for him, made a big difference.
So we want to start this series by taking a look at what we're talking about in terms of disabilities and some of the terminology that gets used, and some of the particular situations in hospitals. We're also going to be talking in the next couple of webinars about pastoral roles in hospitals and in congregations, and also roles as advocates. But the legal definition of a disability is in the ADA in the U.S. as a person who's got an impairment that substantially limits one or more major activities, or they might have a record of such an impairment. And it can be people who are regarded as having a disability. Most disabilities intellectual disabilities are disabilities characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and in adaptive behavior, which can cover a range of everyday social and practical skills. These kinds of disabilities originate before the age of 18. We often talk in the world of disability also about acquired disabilities, from brain injury, spinal cord injury, strokes, accidents, and others. And those may have intellectual implications like brain injury, but they're not an intellectual or developmental disability in the sense of they mostly would have not been acquired before the age of 18. Intellectual disability is no longer an IQ measurement, and all of those areas, the three key things above, intellectual functioning, adaptive behavior, and the age of origin, are key. It's a broad term that includes what used to be called mental retardation, now called intellectual disability. In this country, learning disabilities in the UK, cerebral palsy, autism, Fragile X, spina bifida, and others. So what do I call you if you're my patient, as a pastor or as a chaplain, or a member of my congregation? First, these days, for most people with disability, by their name, preferably. And the whole issue of labeling and naming, labeling really brings to fore the power of naming and how we name people and how we name things, the power of labels, how to talk with people who have certain kinds of conditions. Respectful choices around intellectual disabilities can include developmentally disabled, intellectual disability, or intellectual and developmental disability. People, for the most part, do not use mental retardation anymore, and certainly not the older scientific names that were official scientific terms at some points, including retard, moron, imbecile, feeble-minded, or other kinds of names in history. There are two national movements going on right now in the disability world that in some sense are contradictory, but they're apart, but they're also closely related. One, many people with intellectual disabilities, particularly self-advocates and their friends, have a number of campaigns centered around banning the R word. It's a part of ongoing efforts to use what is called person-centered language. Don't use the label as a noun. Talk to me with my name, or use person with an intellectual disability. Keep the person front and center. But there's also a movement that's come out of some areas of disability, including the hearing impaired or the deaf community, and increasingly from the autistic community, and some in other forms of the disability community, where another campaign, for instance, is called "Just Say the Word," that I'm disabled. Don't use, or you are disabled. Don't use euphemisms like specially challenged or other euphemisms. And what you see in this is people, like other marginal groups have done, taking a label that had been pejorative and turning that around into a positive statement of identity and something that's central to who they are as a person. What's normal? There is really, in a sense, no such thing of normal. The whole idea of normal was really a relatively new concept. In the 19th century, development mathematics began to understand averaging and then statistical norms. And so then an average in a population measurement or a community health measurement or an average about people became a norm, and that norm then became a factor as people moved along, contributing to fear of difference, a huge desire to be normal, and then contributing to fear about people who were on the edge of that bell curve, people who were different, leading eventually in the 19th century to the eugenics movement, which was mostly in response to, very much like these days, fear of the number of strangers and immigrants and strange people coming to this country. And how does one maintain what would have been thought of as the normal, quote, American citizen? Autism, Maggie's the expert here, and we'll let her go with this.
So within the broad range of intellectual and developmental disability, autism is kind of the thing that makes me get very excited. Does it sound like my audio is echoing, or is that just me? Okay, it seemed to have fixed itself. I am the proud parent of a 10-year-old son who is on the autism spectrum. And I, over the last 10 years, have gone from being a person who had no idea what autism meant to being able to learn more about it, become engaged in ways to help, talk with researchers, talk with senators and congressional representatives, and really be a part of bringing this into our public consciousness. So what is autism? It is a neurological disorder characterized by deficits in both language and communication. And it is becoming more part of our social consciousness now. There are people that we see, that we know, who have autism, that are on the autism spectrum. Some of them are being pictured on the screen. There's also a greater sense of portraying people with disabilities within pop culture. So it's a really broad umbrella of terms, though. Within the last few years, we've been further refining this through the Diagnostical Statistical Manual, the DSM-5 now. And what you're seeing is all of the older labels: classic autism, sensory processing disorder, Asperger's, Rett's disorder. All of those are now captured under a larger umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. And so that can be someone who is very mildly affected. Their symptoms are very, very mild. And that can be someone who is more classically autistic. Things like Rain Man might come to mind. Also someone who is completely nonverbal and really profoundly affected by the disorder. It's really a broad spectrum of people that we're talking about. So within the DSM-5, autism spectrum disorder talks about deficits in social communication and social interaction. You see restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. As Bill mentioned, these are things that are present from very early in childhood, and they limit or impair everyday functioning or relationships. It's really pervasive. Common behaviors we might see are decreased eye contact, uneven development of skills, someone who is perhaps very gifted with math computation, but isn't able to complete some other basic daily functioning. So there's a really unevenness in their development. Resistant to changes in routine, insistence on sameness. We can see either a marked hyperactivity or an extreme passivity, and those can alternate back and forth. There's less demonstration of typical signs of affection, things that you might think of ways to show people that you love them, that you like them, that you care about them. Those demonstrations happen differently in people that are on the autism spectrum. Also odd body movements or postures, and that could be flapping, spinning, things like that. So what does that look like? When you walk into a parishioner's home, when you walk into a patient's hospital room, what are the things that you are going to see? You might see someone looking down instead of at you when you speak, maybe looking at their lap, not answering questions or not answering them right away. Not wanting to be touched is something that is frequently seen in the autism community. Repetitive rocking, swaying, or bouncing. Walking only on their toes. If you are walking down the hallway with a patient and you notice that their heels never touch the floor, they're doing toe walking, that could be something that you see. Also flapping their hands, especially in moments of joy or frustration, and making noises that are not words. We call those vocalizations. Sensory sensitive. This can be a really big deal for people in the autism spectrum disorder. Frequently, they experience sensory input more acutely than their peers. This increased sensitivity can be to heat and cold, light and dark, textures on clothing or on surfaces. It can have to do with sound, especially loud noises. It can be something simple like a texture in a food or a strong smell. And with all of those other sensory things going on, it's really easy to be overwhelmed or distracted by all of this extra sensory input.
Not behaviors in hospitals that go very well.
Yes, exactly. Really, really challenging within a hospital setting. This is also a growing population. According to the CDC's latest report, 1 in 68 children will be diagnosed with autism. A recent government survey has even higher numbers, 1 in 45. So whether we're looking at the number of people who have been diagnosed or the number of people who are currently receiving services, and that accounts for the difference in the two prevalence numbers, it works out to roughly 2% of the population that's affected.
Definition, and as Maggie just talked about, definitions like in the world of autism are ever changing as people try to get more refined and as trying to understand what a particular disability may be. The whole concept of disability originated as a way of assessing which veterans should get of national war should get public assistance. And then as the medical science rose, disability began to be seen primarily as like a medical problem, a disease, or something wrong with the human body. As we talked about earlier, old diagnoses had this evolution of becoming pejorative labels. moron, feeble-minded, imbecile, all official scientific terms at one point, then turning later on into schoolyard taunts or bullying tactics. The initial, some fairly good facility-based programs in the 19th century and the 1800s turned later into institutions where people were warehoused as eugenics and the fear of, again, the others. More and more people were sent to institutions as the place to deal, as a way to deal with the solution to deal with these kinds of issues. The first place that I worked at as a chaplain in the 1920s was, the title of it was literally the Newark State School for Feeble-Minded Young Women of Childbearing Age. So that, and there's some recent press and some recent books on, in fact, eugenics and the Supreme Court decisions that led to the policies of sterilization as ways of trying to control the number of people who were different. But after World War II, that began to change pretty radically. Veterans coming back who were disabled, parents of children with disabilities who no longer wanted to send their son or daughter to an institution, as they had been told to do by professionals for years. And then conscientious objectors who had worked in institutions during the war really became the forces behind the change. In 1980, the World Health Organization developed a sort of named this medical model in a way of, as a way of looking at disability with a threefold model that used the words impairment, handicap, and disability. That impairment was a loss of a function or an abnormality in the body or of a function that had some origin in one's psyche or psychology or anatomy. That impairment caused then a disability, a limitation or a loss of being able to function in a normal way that came from that impairment. So the impairment creates a disability. And then the third level of the model was that a handicap, using the word handicap, which is not used much these days, that the handicap was the disadvantaged condition that came from the impairment or the disability that that also limited a person performing a role considered normal. That the handicap is what people thought of a disability, and those kind of social, age-related, cultural factors that led to treatments that disadvantaged people with disabilities. So the ICH-IDH model, you went kind of from a disease to an impairment to a disability to a handicap, and looking at it that way. That was immediately countered, or there were protests about this model by people with disabilities, who began to talk more about the social model of disability rather than the dominant medical model. The social model focuses more on the systemic barriers, negative attitudes, and exclusion, which meant that society is really the main contributing factor in disabling people. So while people may have physical, sensory, intellectual, or psychological variations, which cause impairments, those don't lead to a disability unless a society fails to take account of those and include people regardless of their differences. So the specific term of a social model of disability emerged from the UK in the 1980s. The current WHO model, if you look, it's kind of a complicated model, but you think about a disorder or a disease, and this can be, you can really expand this to think about anything other, as well as a disease, as well as a disability. That there are bodily functions and structures that are impacted, that impact one's activity and usual level of activity, and impact one's level of participation in society and in the community, or in typical, normal, everyday things. And those activities are impacted also not just by the bodily function or by the disability or disorder or disease, but also by environmental factors, an environment, for instance, can be handicapping or disabling if people can't get anywhere, if they're using a wheelchair, for instance, or canes or other kinds of accommodations. But an environment and activity can also be limited by personal factors and what people think about their own disability and their own image of what is happening to them, issues of stigma, sense of value, and who I am and identity. So it's a very interactive definition that circulates around lots of factors. The progression of responses that people have to disability, and to intellectual disability in particular, one of the first progressions I learned was from a Catholic chaplain who was a colleague of mine in upstate New York, who said, "Bill, people go from fear to pity to anger to love." And what he meant was that people are often afraid of what they don't know, afraid of difference, to then feeling sorry for people who maybe have an intellectual disability or another disability, to then, as they get to know someone, they begin to get angry at the kinds of injustices or the barriers or the attitudes that person has had to face. And then, though, even in anger, if you stay with someone and become their friend, you get to a point where there's a sense of, I may be helping or doing something for this person, but they are also doing something for me. It's very much of a mutuality in relationship. And that's the same kind of thing we can see in the historical stages of services in the last century, moving from a sense of people being demonic or strange who should be excluded from society, to a whole new decades of specialized services, special education for or to people with disabilities, to then a rising function and a focus on civil rights, people with disabilities, and finally, and then after that, from people saying, rights may get me a right to be part of a society or community, but I want a chance to contribute and to belong, a sense of contribution and mutuality with citizens, and becoming full members of both citizens, congregations, and parts of our communities. Our own responses as chaplains and pastors are going to be shaped by your own personal history with disability, people you know in your family, experiences that you've had in the past. It's going to be shaped by social and public constructions of disability that you're familiar with. One of the ones, for instance, that many people with disabilities hated for years was the Jerry Lewis fundraising events at Labor Day weekend, and about that whole public construction of this person of a disability as someone who deserved pity and then donations and contribution. There's often in seminary or in CPE very little exploration of the implications of disability, even in courses that deal with diversity and marginalization or family issues or building community. Lots of places where disability, in fact, is impacted by other issues that we're going to talk about. And then also key are the theological constructions that we have around what disability is, what it means for us, what it means in relationship to God and to our own image of ourselves as God's people. Some of the general language guidelines: avoid the word normal, which implies correctness or preference. In relationship to autism, for instance, there's a new word called, it's neurotypical, that you and I are neurotypical folks. We may also say that people without disabilities are non-disabled or not disabled. Avoid euphemisms like special challenges or specially abled or whatever. Avoid specialness in general. There's an Australian comedian with a disability who coined the term inspiration porn, that many comes out of many people with disabilities saying, I don't want to be seen simply as an inspiring person to you or to others. I just want to be a person with gifts and limits like everyone else. If you're uncertain about an individual who's a patient or a family about what words to use, ask them. It gives them choice and respects their autonomy and lets them know that you are sensitive to the ways that labels can impact people. Use a personal name, inviting other people to do the same. And especially when you're talking to someone who's the patient, talk to the person rather than to the caregiver. Even if the caregiver is helping you with the interpretation, make the eye contact with the individual and assume that there's competence there. There's one of the biggest phrases in the disability world is nothing about me without me. Don't talk to my mom or my dad or my caregiver who may be in the room as if I was not present. There are lots of potential places to encounter disability in hospital settings and over the lifespan. One would be at birth or a diagnosis when a family is dealing with an initial diagnosis of a child with a disability. The second is certainly after an accident or trauma, emergency rooms, rehabilitation units. People with disabilities can be sick just like anybody else and can end up in the hospital because of cancer, kidney problems, a disease, you name it. Disability does not equal disease. People with disabilities can have diseases. And then end-of-life issues are particular areas where many people with disabilities and their families struggle with the ways people make assumptions about quality of life or other kinds of issues. We'll be coming back to those. So,
Bill talked about the trauma bay and the emergency department. This is actually a picture of our trauma bay here at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. To look at it as a person who is neurotypical, this is incredibly intimidating to look at. There's stuff hanging from the ceiling. There are 3 beds. And when a trauma comes in, that space is packed full of people. And it suddenly becomes a space that is frenetic, that is noisy, and that would intimidate anyone, frankly. And so when you take that experience and you add an intellectual or developmental disability on top of it, suddenly you have a real pressure cooker kind of a situation.
Oh, sorry.
No, not a problem. So patient experiences when they come into the hospital, overwhelming is probably something that I hear the most. There are strangers that are all around them. All of this is out of the ordinary. And those strangers are touching you. They are talking to you. They are shining bright lights at you. In the midst of the care that you're receiving, there is a siren going on outside. And there are so many needles, which not many of us enjoy. Even when you look outside of the emergency department and just routine hospitalizations for appendix or a GI infection, there's a lot about being in the hospital that's very disorienting. You are changing your entire routine. You're sleeping in a different bed, eating different food. There are unfamiliar noises, even on a regular med-surg unit, beeping of machines, footsteps walking outside of your door. Everything is just sort of off. And all of this is happening on top of the fact that you're already not feeling well, necessitating you being at the hospital. So all of those things create this perfect storm of being unsettled and being very anxious. In terms of the experiences of the family, I think it's really important to think about disability and the way that it sort of ripples out to the larger family structure. This quote is autism specific, but I think that it really applies to more than just autism. Walsh writes that autism affects the entire family. A diagnosis of autism for one family member will affect the whole family system. And it's a stress-producing situation. This is one of my favorite cartoons. I have moments where I certainly identify with this. Caregiver stress is something that lasts a lifetime. For people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, these are not the kinds of things that you can go through a course of treatment and be all better or normal. These are conditions that are pervasive throughout the course of your life. On top of that, half of people diagnosed with autism also wander. The area of the brain, the frontal cortex that deals with understanding safety, is affected by autism. So it's very frequently the case that children and adults on the autism spectrum will wander away from areas of safety. So there's this extra concern about not just dealing with the disorder, but also dealing with their bodily safety. And in terms of receiving services throughout the course of a lifetime, 84% of adults with autism live with their parents. So there's this sense that as a parent or a caregiver, this is something that you will deal with from childhood through young adulthood and through the entire course of that person's life. A very interesting study was done from the University of Wisconsin, and it looked at the level of stress that autism parents undergo, specifically autism moms. And what it found was that mothers of adolescents and adults with autism experience chronic stress comparable to combat soldiers and struggle with frequent fatigue and work interruptions. These moms also spend significantly more time caregiving than moms of those without disabilities. So the phrase is that, you know, an autism mom is like being a combat soldier, except at some point, combat soldiers get to come home from the war. But it's not all bad news. This sense of unrelenting stress has a sense of galvanizing people for a great many of us. Autism moms are fierce advocates. There are themes of not just adversity, but also resilience, which within pastoral care is a big buzzword right now. Everybody talks about resilience. And all of this adversity does have a sense of stealing someone's mettle, giving them a sense of resilience, or at least it can. Autism parents have frequent exposure to medical professionals and years of experience advocating for their children. So these are caregivers who have been through doctors and specialists, emergency departments, and special treatment facilities. These are folks that are generally pretty savvy about their healthcare experience, that will ask questions, that will demand details, and that really tend to go to bat for their loved ones. It's striking a balance between someone who is very weary from the experience, but also kind of wary about, you know, who are you and what's going to happen next. I went to an autism summit a few months ago, and there was this extraordinary woman named Suzanne that shared her experience of what it was like to have now an adult son. And her son David is now 25 years old. So she was really at the forefront of things beginning to turn from just simply getting special services to really including people with disabilities into the life of the community. And 25 years ago, the kinds of services that we take for granted now simply were not available. And this is what she had to say. She said, and I would call and they'd say, we don't treat autism. And I'd say, I don't want you to treat autism. I want you to treat my son. There's also a big theme of needs being unmet. Again, not just with autism, but also within the entire developmentally disabled community. There was a study within nurses and special needs caregivers that talked about the idea of, well, of course you're going to get support from your church community or from your faith community. And what this nurses study found was that there can't be an assumption about being part of a faith community necessarily meaning that you're getting the social support and the spiritual support that your family needs. So there's really a gap in need versus services. People will frequently report experiences of isolation, even within their faith communities. And social stigmas surrounding autism, surrounding disability in general, still make it a really touchy thing to be part of a faith community and fully integrated in that faith community. Really, there's a duality of experience. On the one hand, parents and caregivers believing to their core that their child is capable of a relationship with a higher power. People that know that their loved one has the gift of spirituality. And yet, on the other hand, experiencing that isolation and that social stigma that make it really difficult, really fraught to be a part of a religious community. There's also a possibility of multiple hospitalizations. Chronic health and disability can lead to hospital fatigue and trauma. The sense that you are a frequent flyer coming back to the hospital yet again, going to the doctor's office yet again. Who is there to support you through myriad hospitalizations? Is it family supporting the individual with the disability? Is it caregiving staff, maybe from a facility living situation? And what is the response of these people that are accompanying their loved one once again to the hospital? As you encounter people with disabilities and their caregivers, are these caregivers drawing closer within that moment? Or is burnout part of their experience? It can frequently be both. And for people that are working in a longer term setting, whether it's a rehab or even a hospital situation, and you get to know people over the course of their hospitalization, frequently you will see moments of both drawing closer, and then maybe the next day they're more burnt out. So having both of those, again, is the duality of experience. And Bill touched on this a little bit earlier, and our second webinar is going to deal more with end-of-life issues and grief and things like that. But presence and dignity are two themes that are really quite important for all people, and especially for those with IDDs.
I had a conversation this last week with a friend of mine who's a pediatric neurologist in Chicago, and we talked about some of the issues that he sees in hospitals, and these are woven through here, that often the disability overshadows the rest of somebody's identity. In fact, I've got a link there to a Healthcare Passport, which is a small 4-page document that families and caregivers have used to put down on paper something about who this person is, especially if they don't communicate very well, and so who they are as a person and things that they like. Disability also intersects with so many other issues: culture, race, class, disparities, age of diagnosis, visibility. There's a wide gap and a gulf between the experiences of white children and adults and minority children and adults. Too often, minority children and adults don't get the services, yet they, in fact, are diagnosed with a higher incidence of intellectual disability in school systems, which is, again, is a double kind of a vicious cycle. Peter, my friend Peter the doc, said people in hospitals often make quality of life assumptions that disability can't be fixed, and that anything related to disability is a negative prognosis. You can't fix it. You can't cure it. How do we get consent? Who's going to make decisions? If somebody doesn't talk very well, how do we ask their opinion? How do we give the voice? How do they give them preference or voices in their care? There are not many advocates in hospitals for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There's very little training for physicians in this area, no specialty for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and a real challenge to the general acute care culture, where pace moves quickly, intellect is prized, doctors and others are supposed to be smart and fast, and people with intellectual disabilities and multiple disabilities and autism mess up the systems and the box, slow people down, make things less productive. A concern, especially in these new days of managed care, and how much people are dealing with those kinds of issues. There are public policy values that drive services right now, including independence, productivity, inclusion, self-determination, and cultural competence. These are the values that you see in many public services. around disability, and yet underneath all those values that are often very key spiritual issues, uh, spiritual questions that people wonder about somebody's independence. It's about who am I as a person? Uh, who am I? In my identity? The productivity question, when people talk about employment for people with disabilities or being productive citizens, it's the question of what's my purpose in life? Why am I? The question of inclusion, whose am I? Who do I belong to? Where's my community? Self-determination is questions about what kind of power do I have? What kind of voice and agency? Will I be respected for my uniqueness and my differences, not just because of my disability or my culture as well, or the combination of those? And from a Judeo-Christian perspective, am I seen as fearfully and wonderfully made, even if I'm living with an intellectual disability? Theological issues we'll go into in the future include why the disability, whose fault, faith, healing, and cure questions, the equation of faith with reason and intellect. And
yes. I wanted to jump in with a quick story. I had wonderful encounters with a young woman who we'll call Becky. And I think this really highlights some of the theological issues that are important. Becky was a young woman with a very long list of comorbidities. She had neurologic issues, gastrointestinal issues, neuromuscular issues, and her verbal communication was profoundly affected by her myriad challenges. She had, I think, about 6 words of functional communication, which included things like yes, no, mom, juice. So very, very basic functional words. And yet within that, she also had this incredibly vibrant prayer life. Luckily, I learned that she was Roman Catholic. And so when I went to visit her one day, I asked if she would like to see the priest. And she said yes. And I said, okay, I'll make sure the priest comes. Would it be okay for us to pray today? And she looked very serious and she said, oh, yes. So I thought, okay, she's Catholic. Let's try the Lord's Prayer. And it turned out that she joined in with me with her incredibly limited verbal communication skills. She had mastered the Lord's Prayer. And so we went through one word at a time to pray together. And she was very deliberate about pronouncing each word and getting through every syllable. It took us probably 5 minutes to get through the duration of this very short prayer. And yet, to watch what that experience was for her, to see the change that came over her face. She was praying. She was legitimately affected deeply by the spiritual experience. And even though this would look very different for other people, this was something that you could tell was so deeply important for her. So all of that is to say that theological issues, yes, and yet vibrant theological life, absolutely. So, thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you. And simply, if you ask people with disabilities and their families just to tell you their church story or their synagogue story, whatever their tradition, they're often going to tell you stories about how either important it's been or how not important it's been, about how they've wanted things or have been turned away sometimes, often from congregations and faith communities. But it goes deeper into sort of just listening to people's story and seeing a person who's labeled maybe with both a disability label and a disease label. Who are they? What's their story? And getting to know the person dealing with all those things. So here are the stories. Try to find the stories. Model the acceptance and inclusivity. Try to find other parts of identity and share them. Everybody's got strengths and weaknesses, interest, listen to behavior, In the world of autism, we're learning particular now every behavior is a sign of, is a communication in some way. And listen to that behavior, talk to people who know people best. Symbol and ritual can be crucial. Try to be simple but not childish when you're talking to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They're not children, especially the adults. And use the core values of patient and family-centered care. Let's turn now to some questions. And one of the things on the slides that'll be up that you can get, there's going to be a number of resources that you can tap into in the next few slides. And we also thought that if you've got vignettes or verbatims that have been excellent learning or training experiences for you or for your hospital, we'd love to get them and put them together as a resource pool that could be used in other CPE groups. So let's turn to some questions. And Mark, I'll let you help us with those.
Again, if you've got questions and you move your mouse, you'll find the Q&A button, and you can type in your question there for the presenters.
Question just popped up. How do you suggest starting the change in hospital culture? That is a really, really big issue. And I think that some medical teams are more tuned into that than others. We had a case of a young man with autism come into the trauma bay just this last week. And some of the nurses were very baffled by how do you interact with this person and what do you do? And another one of our nurses, Nurse Bob, was such a trooper. He thought, oh, well, this person is having anxiety. Let's give him something to do. So I think those moments of finding a word search for an anxious patient to be able to engage them in a new way. Those happen one at a time, and I think we sort of chip away at the iceberg little by little. And I like that sort of a hearts and minds approach for dealing with change. I think it's the more effective way, in my experience, because I think it can be really humanizing for people. The more that you see a human being lying in the hospital bed and not a label and a disability, I think the easier it is to connect and communicate.
Sorry, I've got the slides wrong here on the thing, but one of the things also I think is for chaplains, how do we start any kind of change in a hospital setting is by modeling the behavior, modeling interest and the way we treat people and see people. It's also that there are lots of for instance, the JCHO roadmap around person and family-centered care is a resource for hospitals and for people, and that includes strategies for teaching people around disability issues, cultural issues, and spirituality issues. I know that with autism becoming also a very hot word and a public word, and a lot of focus on autism these days, there are a number of hospitals are beginning to do autism trainings, particularly for people in emergency rooms. And I think having a place where you begin somewhere like that, and then it can be another way to help then broaden that out. And I think the best resource, one of the best resources for hospitals and clinical pastoral education programs would be simply to invite people with disabilities and their family members to talk with you in a training session and talk about their hospital experiences. Think together about ways that chaplains, nurses, and other staff can help make those experiences more humane for people in hospitals. There are, in parts of the country, there are in fact some family advocacy organizations that have grown up just because of negative experiences that families feel like they've had or their son or daughter has had, particularly if their son or daughter is a person with multiple disabilities, has ended up in hospitals a lot because of seizures or other kinds of conditions. And just feeling like their family member just does not get seen for who they are as a person, and where the disability shadows everything else. So a lot of hospitals work on patient-centered or patient satisfaction and family satisfaction. That's perhaps is one way to start talking to people who have been patients and consumers of medical services, to talk about ways that a particular hospital might improve their care or just hear their experience.
Bill, I don't know if you can see the list of questions. We've got about 10 questions that have come in now.
Okay, you keep going with them.
Okay, we've touched a little bit on training. We'll do a little bit more about advanced directive conversations, end-of-life planning in the next webinar. So there's more to come with those. I'm scrolling through to see if there's any that we can touch on in the last couple of minutes. Someone's asking a question about tools and resources that I drew on in providing care and support for my interaction with Brian. He was the young man in our psych emergency center with autism. And on the one hand, interacting with him was just like interacting with any other patient that I encounter. I let him tell his own story in his own words. I provided a non-judgmental person to talk to, and especially within the confines of the peak, I tend to present myself as not a doctor, not a nurse, because that automatically sets up the relationship that I'm not here to judge you or label you or diagnose you, and I'm not here to stick you with any needles. So that kind of, gets my foot in the door a little bit. And then with him, I let him be the person directing where our conversation went. He was drawing me pictures of Michael Jackson because he had this obsession with Michael Jackson. And that was how we went from drawing the pictures of what his different costumes and different music videos were to him demonstrating dance moves down the middle of the corridor. But all of those things were important to him. And the things that I kept in mind within that conversation were keeping my verbal cues to him as simple as possible. Bill talked about simple but not childish. So my general rule of thumb is don't use 10 words when 4 will do. I think the chaplains are really good at flowery language. We can sort of lean back in a chair and say, oh, well, I'm wondering about what your heart is telling you right now. And that's pretty dense for someone with an intellectual disability. So being a little bit more blunt, a little more directive, maybe offering something like, how does it feel to be here? Or what are you feeling right now? Or, gosh, I might feel scared. Opening it up and giving him an opportunity to fill the space with the things that were important to him. So those were a couple things that I sort of had in my tool basket when I was meeting with him. I'm scrolling through the rest of the conversations here. Bill, maybe you want to take this one. Asking about if we could say something more about balancing compassion and accountability in pastoral care and education of people with disabilities.
Compassion and accountability. My sense is that pastoral care is at the heart of pastoral care. What's effective pastoral care is the capacity to walk along beside people as they are going through their journey with their illness and in that setting. that our accountability really is to the individual and to the family in the long run. But we do work for systems, and we work for organizations where frequently experiences of where we run across experiences where that call for us to advocate as chaplains. I remember when I was in my residency year in Chapel Hill, having a patient with a chronic disease who thought I walked on water, partly because every time he sort of would complain about something, a little bit later, on my way out, would go check with a nurse about it, and then something would get changed. I wasn't going to complain for him, but just to check with them. And it's I think is, how do we be accountable, help the system to work better? And one of the things I think you do around that is, again, to use the values of the system that you're in, not just the values of pastoral care and of compassion, but the values and the mission statements of hospitals and places we work. There are things that people do a lot of work on there to say, we are trying to do this with all patients. And I think you will find out that people with disabilities raise real questions about those, or the kinds of issues that come up around people with disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and their families, are ones that really illustrate some of the heart of many of those issues. And over again, in my experience, has been as people figure out what to do with a person with an intellectual or behavioral disability, what the effective, compassionate response ends up being good for lots of other people as well. So I hope that gets at the compassion, accountability, balancing that the question implied.
Okay, let's see. We might have time for maybe one more. I'm mindful of the clock here. Last question talks about being a pastor in a congregation with developmental disabilities, and really being challenged to be notified or included in care when someone is in the hospital or in the midst of struggle. And this person is sort of wanting to know how to best become part of the care team. I think there's maybe two sides to that for my thinking. On the one hand, from my own personal experience, every time I go to the hospital with my son isn't necessarily a time that I would need support, just because we're frequently going to the hospital or specialists. So I don't think we need to raise the alarm bells every time, but for major life events, yeah, absolutely. I would encourage directness, compassionate directness, with the caregiving team and with the patient, and just, say, I really want to be involved in journeying with you when you need it. So kind of normalizing that experience for them and saying, if you are in the hospital for 2 or 3 days, give me a call, let me know, so that I can be a part of the team that's helping you. And it could be that you get pushback because you're one more person who is there to ask questions and to be involved, and that could feel overwhelming. But this is an opportunity for, again, autonomy and choice, asking what their preferences are, and letting them know that, yes, when you're offering to help, you really do mean it.
Okay. Sorry, Bill, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and that's a parallel to the problem that any pastor has about let a family or a hospital or somebody letting them know they're in a hospital. And people say, why did you come to see me? Well, nobody told me. But it gets more complicated because of other people who are making decisions about whether or in somebody's life with an intellectual disability, whether it's an agency person or family person or others. So I think it's, if you're a presence in those persons' lives, just to let them know and let the agencies know that you're there to help in case something happens. Because if somebody goes into a hospital from a group home or something like that, that's not something that a lot of agency staff deal well with. And your ministry there is both with the individual, also maybe with the direct care staff who have been sent to help watch a person in a hospital room.
Okay, thank you to Bill and Maggie for today's presentation and to everybody for joining us today. We hope that you'll join us for the remaining webinars in the series. You can sign up for those on the ACPE Academy webpage. The recording of today's webinar, as well as a copy of the slides and information about other webinars, can be found on the webpage as well. Wishing you all a wonderful day.